Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 23 of the Gospel of Matthew. We're covering Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 through 30, and this one's called Rest for Your Souls. I just finished my hand surgery. Everybody, thank you for the prayers. Hopefully that goes well. It's a little hard to use right now. This chapter finishes with a bang. We live in a world that is filled with difficulties. Yesterday, as most of you know, I had surgery on my right hand, and that hand will be unusable for quite a while, which is a great challenge to my work and daily studies. But challenges don't make our lives difficult when we serve an all-powerful God. Yesterday, I communicated with some dear friends who are out of state attending a funeral. Once again, not easy, but when we have God in our lives, we always can handle any difficulties. As we are reading the Gospel of Matthew, keep in mind the difficulties that existed in that time and in Israel. The Jews were under Roman rule. In addition, every Jew was burdened by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and the priests. Following their law was much more rigid than following God's law. Jesus came to remove the burden of the law through grace. God's riches at Christ's expense. Getting what we don't deserve, unmerited favor. For any who are burdened today, those burdens do not come from the God who died to free us. Let's read our first passage today. Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 through 19 says this. But to what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to their companions and saying, We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For God came neither eating nor drinking, that they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, Look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. This passage sounds like some of the children wanted to play wedding, while the other group wanted to play funeral. Certainly, these two are opposites. Years ago, a friend of mine who was a doctor told me this story. He had a patient who was a quadriplegic. Though he had treated the quadriplegic for many years, he had never asked what happened to cause that. One day they had a conversation about the cause. The young man described a time when he and his sister went on a trip with their mother. She was driving, and they were both in the back seat. The mother got tired of the brother and sister fighting and told them to stop. When they didn't, she pulled the car over and shot them. As I heard this story, I expected what the rest of you likely expected when hearing the story, that the mother became distracted and it caused a wreck. But instead, the mother's actions, at least attempted, to wreck the lives of 3 people. Of course, she went to prison. Sadly, she killed the daughter, and the young man survived, but became a quadriplegic. But the amazing part of the story is that the quadriplegic became a happy and upbeat man. The doctor telling me the story had a point to make. He said that some people are depressed and will always gravitate to depression, regardless of what happens in their lives. It is actually where they prefer to be. At the same time, some people always look for the positives, like the young man in the story. I think Jesus was describing those 2 types of people in this story. And even with these children, some wanted to celebrate and play wedding, while the others wanted to lament and play funeral. It doesn't sound like the days of Jesus were that much different than the days of today. No matter what Jesus did, it would never have been good enough for everyone. In my opinion, most people are selfish. In that manner, most people prefer to be the gods of their own lives. Years ago, I was teaching a weekly Bible study to 3 young men who were in a sober living house. All three had just completed a rehab program for substance abuse. One of the three, in particular, really struggled with God. I remember him saying that he did not want God to control his life. I reminded him that because God was God, it really didn't matter if he wanted God to control his life or not. If God wanted to control his life, God simply would do that. It was amazing to watch the situations that God continued to put that young man in until he finally surrendered. But I think that is one of the main reasons that many people are unwilling to come to God and to boldly approach the throne of grace. Multiple times in the Old Testament, the Bible states that people were doing what was right in their own eyes. It really comes down to a choice. Will we live to please ourselves? Will we live to please others? Or will we live to please God? Let's read the next passage. Matthew chapter 11, verses 20 through 24 says this. Then he began to rebuke the cities in which most of his mighty works had been done, because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, who were exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. But I say to you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. We have discussed this passage in our earlier studies in the Gospel of Matthew. Most people know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. God destroyed those cities because of the unrighteousness that went on among the people in those cities. In fact, Abraham attempted to change the mind of the angel of the Lord, who was likely Jesus, from destroying those cities. Abraham begins his negotiation by asking if he could find 50 righteous men in those cities, if the cities could be spared. Abraham was trying to ensure that his nephew Lot was spared. The angel of the Lord accepted those terms, and then Abraham renegotiated. Abraham then asked if the cities could be spared if there were 45 righteous men. As this negotiation continued, Abraham moved to 40 men, 30 men, 20 men, and finally they arrived at 10 men. But there were not 10 righteous men in Sodom and Gomorrah. In this passage in Matthew, Jesus states that the towns of Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum will be punished even more than Sodom and Gomorrah were. The reasoning for this is that because Jesus chose to spend so much time in the Galilee near these three towns, that all three of those locations had been given more opportunities than anywhere else to know he was the Messiah that the people had been waiting for. All the people living in those cities had been so blessed. Both Chorazin and Bethsaida were 6 miles from Capernaum. What cities today have had the greatest opportunity to hear about Jesus? Vatican City comes to mind. Houston, Texas might also fit in that category, as one of the largest megachurches exists there, that of Joel Osteen, with 45,000 weekly attendance, hearing about positive attitude more than a focus on Jesus. It would not surprise me in the least if these locations were similarly judged. Let's read our last passage today. Matthew 11, verses 25 through 30 says this. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and prudent and have revealed them to babes. Even so, Father, for so it seemed good in your sight. All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now we get to the heart of the passage. First, Jesus re-emphasizes that we cannot know the Father without knowing Jesus, and only Jesus can reveal the Father to us. No one knows Jesus without the Father either. Next, Jesus focuses on what knowing him will bring to us. Rest for the weary, rest for our souls. Every single person alive on this earth has the same 24 hours in a day, but each of us has the exact same opportunity to decide what the priorities in our days will entail. There was a professor teaching a class on time management. On the desk in front of him, he had a large, wide-mouthed jar. From below the counter, he placed 5 rocks inside of that jar. He then asked the class if the jar was full, and one young man said that it was. The professor said, "You are incorrect," and then began placing smaller pebbles into the large jar. He asked again, "Is the jar full now?" The same young man once again answered yes, and without saying anything, the professor started filling the jar with sand all the way to the top. He once again asked, "Is the jar full?" No one seemed willing to answer, so the professor then filled the jar with water all the way to the top, and finally the jar was full. There was a huge lesson to be learned, but few of the students grasped what that lesson was. Most thought that the lesson was that they could put a whole lot more into the jar than they thought. But instead, the life lesson was that we all have the same amount of room in our jars, and we need to figure out what the big rocks are first. What is your priority? The only priority that makes any sense is to put Jesus first in our lives. Once that has been done, we will have an amazing amount of rest, and we will feel that rest in our souls. We no longer will be running on a giant hamster wheel going nowhere. When we are yoked to Jesus, we follow him. This reminds me of the verse where Paul says, "Imitate me." The first time I read that, it sounded arrogant, but the longer I walked with Jesus, the more I realized the importance of Christian mentors in our lives. For example, the dear friend of mine who brought me to Jesus walks very closely with Jesus. If I follow him, as he is walking closely with Jesus, I also will be walking closely with Jesus. But we should be careful who we follow. For those claiming to be Christians, if the Christian walk seems to be a burden, that burden does not come from God. Instead, those are self-imposed burdens. Once we become Christians, the closer we walk to Jesus, the more freedom we will feel. Think of what it is like to train a puppy. When we put that puppy on a leash, he stays right with us. Not because that is what he wants to do, but because that is what he is forced to do. But the longer that dog walks beside us and comes to love us, he doesn't want to stray. Instead, he wants to stay with his master. The longer and closer that we walk with Jesus, the same thing occurs. We don't stray because we want to be with our master Jesus. Jesus said, "If you love me, obey my commandments." Obedience to God and love for God work together. We love God because he loved us first. And because we love him, we should obey him. If we don't obey him, then likely we do not love him. It's a blessing to be yoked to Jesus. Have a blessed day. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina.